Santa Clarita WordCamp. But what we tried to do, and it sort of all started with your event last year. There were quite a few of us in this area. One of our organizers, she started a meetup here in San Fernando that focused on accessibility topics. And we heard about WordPress Accessibility Day and we volunteered and some of us spoke. So that sort of got the ball rolling in terms of accessibility. So we wanted to just have a conversation because this WordCamp is sort of a celebration of that. We have,
great.
Yeah, so we have 2 dedicated tracks each day. So we have 6 speakers on Friday, Saturday and on Sunday talking about accessibility specifically. And we thought having you on to chat a little bit about accessibility from your standpoint, from your viewpoint, where you think we need to go as a community. And especially for me, I know this is great for me to talk to you because I'm sort of trying to figure out what I want to do moving forward. And I'd love to hear what you think we can do as a community to sort of build on a lot of the work that you've set with the team at the WordPress Accessibility team and the things that you have planned for the core and just in general, how we can make things better or contribute. So that was sort of what I wanted to sort of talk about.
Well, that sounds just fabulous. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. So again, our event is generally, it focuses on people that are new to the community. I know there's people at different levels all along, but we really try to focus on people that are new to the community, teach them how to do WordPress right, teach them about accessibility and things of that nature. So why don't you sort of talk a little bit about how you got into WordPress for those that may not know you, just a basic intro, and we'll start there.
All right. Well, that's going back quite a long ways. I got started in WordPress in 2006. And I had been working with Blogspot before that. And I got just frustrated with how difficult it was to change things, to modify the templates, the content, how things worked. And since I was already doing accessibility at the time, that was a major frustration. So I started exploring other options, other content management systems, and I found WordPress to be the one that was the most approachable for me at that time to understand and work with. And I could change anything I wanted. And so its extensibility was my entry point in being able to say, I've got a theme. I'm happy with most of it. I don't like this. I can change it. It took 5 or 10 minutes to change a minor thing. And so that was extremely satisfying. And over time, I got more and more involved. I built my first plugin in 2008. And once I knew how to build a plugin, I really started to expand my abilities in what I could do with WordPress.
Awesome. So you mentioned you had already been working in accessibility. Was your first plugin? And I remember from your bio, it may not have been, but when did you start, focusing on building accessibility plugins? And I know you indirectly. And again, this is an honor for me to speak with you because I first met you on Lynda and taking your courses and things like that. So you've always sort of been in the background of what I was thinking about in terms of accessibility. When did you build your first plugins, and what was the sort of the mindset in getting into that realm in terms of doing some accessibility stuff?
So when I started with WordPress in 2006, I was a rank amateur at PHP. I hadn't done a lot. And during that period of, from like 2005 to 2007, I was exploring all kinds of different things. And one of them was that, let me rephrase that. A mistake that almost all developers make at some point is I built my own content management system. And it was accessible, but it was really hard to work with. And every time I wanted to change anything, it was a complete rewrite. So I had like 4 different forked versions of it that I was maintaining. And so WordPress was an opportunity to work with a known base. And then in 2008, I was like, well, I need to know more about how to extend this, because it was still a problem to try and extend things because I had to search for plugins. And so I had 3 kind of skills I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn more about how to work with APIs, application programming interfaces, because I needed to be able to do things with outside resources. I wanted to learn how plugins worked and what I could do with a plugin in, user configuration and posts and all of the various things you could do. And then I just wanted to get better at, I wanted to get better at WordPress in general. So my first plugin is called WP to Twitter, and it's still around. I still maintain it. It had nothing to do with accessibility at all.
Uh-huh.
But it was an entry point, and it was a relatively simple thing to do in that it basically just listened for the event when a post was published and sent off a tweet to Twitter. Great, no problem. That gradually got more and more complicated, of course, as Twitter, got rid of their basic authentication and replaced it with OAuth. And I had to learn all sorts of new things to keep it working. But after that, all of my plugins since then have either been directly related to accessibility or indirectly related to accessibility. And usually it was because I needed to perform some kind of a task. I needed to do something with WordPress, and I couldn't find any resource out there that was already accessible. And so I just started having to build them. And I have released, I think, a total of a dozen public plugins, but there are another dozen at least that I've built and never released and won't. I don't intend to release them because, frankly, one thing I've learned is once you've released a plugin, you have to maintain it more or less forever. There's no money in it, and it gets very difficult over time. So I mostly only maintain the most prominent ones and hope that I can keep up.
Which one do you, and I'm sure they're all like children, which one are you most proud of, or which one solved the biggest challenge that you wanted to try to solve when building it, or just give me an idea of which one you're most proud of?
I think the one I'm most proud of is called My Calendar. And it's a very full-featured calendaring system for plugin, for managing all kinds of events. And it embraces accessibility in a lot of different ways. I mean, I built it because I needed a plugin that was accessible to manage some calendar events. And when I built it in 2009, there were really no options for that. So first of all, it's got the accessible front end, being able to view events and learn about events and manage all of that. But in addition, it also tracks accessibility information about the events if people care to put it in. So you can enter into that plugin things like whether or not your event offers audio description, whether it has live captioning, whether it has ASL services provided. In addition, you can enter information about the venues you're performing at, so that if they've got bariatric seating, you can specify that. If they're handicapped accessible, I apologize, they are wheelchair accessible, you can notify that your audience of that fact. And that's a very useful thing, because the reality of the economy of people with disabilities is that everybody wants to go to the same things. Everybody wants to go to this show. And it's extremely helpful to know before you even buy a ticket, before not having to place a phone call to find out, but just to be able to say, oh, I can get into this building. Oh, I'll be able to use this bathroom. Great, there are chairs for me. Hey, they're offering audio description. And so I'm proud of the fact that I put a lot of thought into making that a plugin that really offers that service.
Yeah, and I know that level of detail is what I appreciate about your work. I know someone that's speaking on our schedule this weekend. We've had great conversations where she's hearing free, and the ability for her to go to see musicals is a big deal. And just the fact that someone like you would take the time to sort of put those things into the plugin that are added benefits to everybody, but for someone that has to worry about that stuff in terms of going out to a musical or wanting to do something, that's really, really appreciated. So that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and I try to put that into my own performing life when I can as well. One of the unique things about the pandemic is, of course, all of my performing ensembles are putting everything online. because we can't have in-person performances. So I just released a concert a couple of days ago. And, we did captions for the concert. Yes, it's music. And yes, if you can't hear the music, you may not get everything. But relatively, there's an element where just knowing what's being said and what the poetry of the songs is about is really meaningful. So it's worth going to that effort. And of course, this included 4 different languages. So I needed to have both a translated version of the captions and an original language one. And YouTube doesn't really support the idea that something is in multiple languages as its original language. Mm-hmm. So I struggled a little bit trying to decide what language I would label the original language version as, since it was actually in Latin, Italian, Spanish, French, and English.
At the same time, yeah.
Well,
tell me a little bit more, for those that don't know, the performance side of Joe Dolson. What does that mean?
Well, I'm a violinist, and so I play a wide variety of music on the violin. This particular concert was an early music ensemble I have with my partner, and we do Baroque music and earlier medieval Renaissance Baroque music. I play the Baroque violin on that, which is very similar to the modern violin, but done with gut strings, with no chin rest, no shoulder rest. So its emphasis is more on resonance and not as much on projection, which is kind of a key difference between the sound quality of Baroque instruments versus modern instruments. But I do a lot of performance. That's one of the many things I do outside of web development.
Oh, that's awesome. And I'm sure that's a great change of pace from doing coding all day and focusing on something that could be as beautiful as something that's a Baroque piece of art.
Definitely.
Awesome. Well, let's shift back into accessibility. Recently, I saw you on, you made the news in that there was an initiative speaking out against accessibility and the plugins on the repository. Can you talk a little bit about that? And for those that may not be aware, just the topic in general and how it impacts accessibility and WordPress in specific.
Yeah, so that is a big topic. Accessibility, for those who don't know about it, is a vendor that provides what's called an overlay toolbar service. It's basically a one line of script you can install on your website, and it will run some artificial intelligence, some machine learning scripts across your website to change things with the idea that it's making things more accessible. And there are some very legitimate ideas behind the idea of using machine learning and automatically addressing accessibility issues. The problem is, it is not a solution. It is not a substitute for actually making your website accessible. And accessibility is one of the worst offenders because they make the explicit claim in their marketing materials that using their plugin, their add-on, will make your website meet ADA requirements. And that is a pile of hooey. It's just wrong. That is not something it does. It might not even make your website better because, frankly, it's that toolbar is incredibly complicated. It offers tons of features that may or may not be helpful. They just change things. And so that's a really frustrating thing. And what I was particularly noticing was they were also doing some really false marketing practices in that they were clearly paying for 5-star reviews on the WordPress plugin directory, which is definitely not allowed in the WordPress plugin directory. So I kind of chased those down and found the evidence and reported it and got those removed. But they're still at it and they're still causing problems.
Yeah, but I mean, I think what's awesome in terms of you leading the voices speaking out on that was that there was a letter that a lot of folks were able to sign in support of the issue. And it's just another example of how the community is really trying to make things better for everyone. Can you talk a little bit about your work on the WordPress Accessibility core team for accessibility, as well as we'll get into a little bit about your WordPress Accessibility Day, the first annual last year. But
right.
Let's talk about your work on the team.
Yeah, so I've been working with the WordPress Accessibility team since 2012. And my first kind of big initiative thing that I kind of pushed forward and got started with was the Accessibility Ready theme tag in the WordPress theme repository. And the idea that themes can be accessible is a very challenging one to even address, because from a very practical standpoint, accessibility doesn't measure a theme. Accessibility measures a page of content, because it's ultimately about whether or not you can find out what this page of information is trying to tell you and whether you can interact with the tools it offers. And a theme only really offers a framework for that content to sit in. So the first step of that process was just figuring out what a theme can be measured against and what it can't be measured against. And that's created some interesting challenges with the WordPress Accessibility Ready program, in that there are constantly people saying that, I installed this theme and my website isn't accessible. It's like, well, right, it doesn't make your website accessible. It just doesn't impose barriers against your website being accessible. But that's a fine subtlety. But since then, I've spent some time as the accessibility team representative. In 2019, I was made a core committer. So now I'm under the stressful responsibility of making sure that the code actually works when I create a patch, as opposed to just creating a patch and trusting somebody else will fix my mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, every step is different. Every role you take has some different aspects to it, because the WordPress accessibility team is small. There's not a lot of funding behind the team. Not a lot of people are getting, corporate dollars to help push things forward and actually put that kind of time in. So we're just always trying to keep up to do, because we're not just trying to make sure that core is accessible. We're trying to make sure that core is accessible, that you can actually use WordPress on the admin side using all sorts of assistive technology. But we're also trying to make sure that all the core themes are accessible on the front end, trying to make sure that the documentation is accessible. We're trying to make sure that WordPress.org itself is accessible. As much as we can, we try and encourage people to make their events accessible. And it's a huge purview to try and get people involved with. But it leaves a lot of potential for people. Like, there's a lot of room. There's a lot of things that can be done.
So what would be, for someone like me, what would be the area where you need the most help, or where we can contribute the most to all of these initiatives that are going on? What would you say is probably priority one, and working your way down in terms of what you need help with?
Well, I always find it difficult to truly give a priority one. But first of all, what you're doing already is great, because having events where you talk about accessibility and promote accessibility is enormous. Because in the large scale of things, what's really going to improve people's lives the most is having more people making accessible websites. So when you have an event like this WordCamp, where you've got 2 tracks of people talking about accessibility all day long, that teaches a lot. That tells people so much information. So that's number one. Communicate, share that. Number 2, honestly, there's so many new things happening right now in WordPress core. This switch over to full screen editing is massive, and it's complicated. and it's really hard to keep up with. I mean, this particular cycle for WordPress 5.8, which is due out at the end of July, I've been focusing on the media library, which is, it's a big thing. It's used throughout WordPress and it's all over the place. So it needs some attention. But it also means that I have hardly looked at the full screen editing environment at all. I just found out the other day that there's a regression in something that we fixed in WordPress core years ago that's now been unfixed in the new widget editor. And it's just like, I wasn't even expecting that. I wasn't expecting that front-end output was going to be changing in the new widget editor, but I suppose I should have thought about that. There's a lot to look at. So more eyes. We need more eyes. People to look at things and respectfully report bugs and issues. And I say respectfully because from a purely practical standpoint, angry bugs don't get the attention that well-documented, polite bugs get. I mean, that's a reality. When somebody reviews a bug report where the person reporting it is obviously upset and angry, they know it's going to be really hard to get more information from this person. And that shouldn't be a barrier, but from a very practical standpoint, it is. It makes it harder to communicate. And communication is what accessibility is all about, and what the web is about, and what WordPress is about, and anything that gets in the way of that is a problem.
Okay. One thing that I remember during the WordPress Accessibility Day planning cycle was we had a back and forth, and I'm sure you get this all the time, and I'm not sure if you remember, but it sort of tags on to what you were talking about themes and full site editing. You mentioned that themes were very opinionated. Do you think that's an area that people should focus on, or with full site editing coming, should people sort of focus on ways to make that more accessible versus working in a theme? Because I was thinking one of my paths could be to start building themes, but when I heard that, it sort of made me think twice.
Well, I mean, full site editing is moving all of the theme work into a totally new place. And where that's going to land is kind of hard to define. In some ways, it's almost feels like it's the end of themes, because if the whole site can be just assembled using blocks, what is a theme doing, really? Mm-hmm. But I'm not really sure on that. I will say that as far as like the world of themes, the biggest, most opinionated themes are all premium. You're looking at things like Avia and can I remember the names of any of these? I don't know. It doesn't matter. I'm not trying to point fingers.
Right.
But the point is, all of these big page builder, site builder themes are extremely opinionated. As a plugin author, I find them incredibly frustrating because they are my most common sources of bug reports, because I will get people saying, this doesn't look right in my theme. And I'll look at their CSS and I'll be like, well, yeah, I'm not going to put important declarations on every single line of my CSS, because my goal as a developer is I want things that are easy to override. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't want somebody to be needing to really fight against my CSS to override it. The downside to that is it gets overridden a lot by accident. I don't have a winning answer to that.
And that's fine. And I guess you talked a little bit about full site editing. What do you think the future is going to be in terms of how accessibility? I know you mentioned being in the program or with the team since 2012. I'm sure you've seen a lot of changes, but how do you see it evolving moving forward?
There's a lot of change coming, and I don't know exactly where it's going in terms of how administrators will interact with these full site editing themes. I know that traditional themes aren't going to go away anytime soon. It'll still be totally possible to build that way. And partially that's because there are a ton of environments where you don't want that kind of churn in your front-end design. You want a stable design that isn't just being tweaked constantly. One thing I do think is changing from an accessibility standpoint is it's slow, but the developers who are working behind the scenes on WordPress, behind the scenes on Gutenberg and the full site editor are really paying attention to accessibility. That doesn't mean they always make a decision that I would agree with and think is the best choice, but they are thinking about these things. And that is a world of difference compared to where it was at the time of WordPress 5.0, when every little accessibility marker was a fight.
Mm-hmm.
Now we still have challenges because the fundamental architecture of something as complicated as full site editing and Gutenberg is challenging. I mean, there's a lot going on there when every single thing in the interface is a control and controls something and does something. There's a lot to do. But I do sincerely feel that on average, overall, things are getting better and that this will eventually be a good product. I also strongly feel it is going to release long before it's a good product. I think it's very reasonable to say that in 2 or 3 years, full site editing will be very good. It will, of course, release, starting in July.
and I'm sure I'm sure there's reasons for that. And in the perfect world, it would come out and it would be ready to go, and everybody would be adopted and start using it right away. And this is an off the wall question. If you could wave a wand and eliminate one issue that you've had, or one challenge that you've had with the accessibility team or with accessibility in general, what would it be and why?
With accessibility, so you threw a number of different choices there. I can pick from all of the selections of the accessibility team or WordPress or accessibility in general. I think if I were to just be able to just globally get rid of one accessibility issue, it would be, how do I say this? It would be the lack of honest acknowledgement that it's a problem, because there are still just too many development teams out there for whom it's just purely an afterthought. Like, if they have to, maybe they'll spend some effort on that. But the primary concern is, I need this control to look like this. I don't really care what underlies it. And I think if we could just have everywhere a global respect for the fact that the people who need this really, truly need it, and it matters, and have some respect for that, it would make a difference. Because I don't think there's much that's actually difficult about the technical side. There are developers out there who do absolutely brilliant things with React that have no accessibility at all. And it's not because it's too complicated. It's because they haven't thought about it. And if people were to just think about it, I think we'd have all of our tools be much, much better.
I said that's a great answer. I know, and I mentioned I was trying to figure out where I sort of fit or what my path should be. And it seems like it takes people to even consider it to make it happen. I know over the past year, when we were all forced to stay home, it really brought out some of those accessibility problems that people in that community have had to deal with their whole lives, like just getting food delivered to your car, be it curbside or ordering online. we saw that all these sites weren't accessible. So to me, it seemed like last year there was a lot more emphasis or attention on it. And I'm hoping that it will continue. There'll be a spotlight shown on it and people will consider it in their development cycles or when they're building their sites. So to me, that's a great story to share.
It is absolutely amazing how things change when suddenly the number of people needing something to be accessible at any specific level just skyrockets. Like for any community, I would say that the biggest thing you can do to kind of help make things more accessible is just to complain when you see an accessibility problem. I think there's a lot of tendency to either say, well, it's not a problem for me, so I'm not the one who should complain. But that's just putting that burden on people with disabilities and saying they need to do this work, and that's not fair. Or there's a tendency to say, well, I can't possibly be the first person to notice this. And it's like, you might not be the first person to notice it, but maybe you're the 10th person to notice it, and they have an issues queue that bumps things up in priority if they hit 10 people who've complained. I mean, you don't know that, but it's definitely the case that developers don't fix problems that they don't know about, and they prioritize problems that they hear more about. So complain, do it. It's fine.
Definitely.
Some people will look at your problem and say, oh, whatever, I don't care. And then you just stop using their product. And others will be like, oh, gosh, thanks for catching that. I was not aware of that problem. And it'll be great.
Let's talk about the WordPress Accessibility Day and what were the thoughts behind that. I think one of the things that really moved me were your opening remarks. And you mentioned WordPress Joe, I believe, the gentleman who passed. And to me, that had me in tears. But it just shows that so many people are so dedicated and make so many impacts on other people's lives by trying to do something with accessibility and trying to make a real impact. Can you sort of talk about those opening moments and how it sort of shaped the WordPress Accessibility Day event itself?
Yeah. I mean, the impetus for WordPress Accessibility Day was basically the idea that we wanted to do something as a team that would give back to the community and share information about WordPress and about accessibility and what you can do in WordPress for accessibility. And Accessible Joe, Joseph Carr O'Connor, had been the team representative for a few years. I don't remember exactly the boundaries of that, but I'd known him for a long time through the CSUN, California State University Northridge Assistive Technology Conference. And then also through, I met him at WordCamp San Francisco in 2014 and had chatted with him on many occasions. And he'd been ill for some time, and then he did die in January, the year we did WordPress Accessibility Day, right around the time we were getting started on planning. And, that definitely hit. He's certainly not the first person I know who's died, or even the first person I've known in the WordPress community to have died. But while we were in the middle of this planning period and knowing that this is something that he was passionate about, one of the last things he did was he actually pitched a talk for CSUN called An Accessible Death, in which he was going to talk about how he was preparing his daughter for the fact of his upcoming death. Because his daughter is nonverbal and fairly profoundly intellectually impaired. And he and his wife had done a lot of talks about working with their daughter and what it was like and how they helped her and how much they loved her because of the relationship they were able to have, because being nonverbal doesn't make you non-human. And I think that accessible death, that talk about that he had proposed, and I'd read the proposal for, really, makes you think about the fact that when you're working on any project, any design project, any whether it's accessibility, usability, whether you're just trying to fix security, anything you're working on, you're working for people. In the end, every single person who uses that website or that application is a real person, and they have feelings, they have an internal life, and you want to try and decrease their frustrations and give them a happy life. And so that's kind of what I was thinking about as we sort of prepared WordPress Accessibility Day. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, and like I said, it set the tone, and it sort of really inspired me to want to do more too. And as we sort of wrap up here, give us something that, give us some closing words or closing comments on what you'd like us to do as a community as we move forward to sort of help. I know this weekend Stefano is speaking on how to contribute to the accessibility team as one possible way. Why don't you sort of leave us with something that you'd like us to do as a community?
I think what I want everybody to do in your community as they're working on a project is to just think about the people who will use it. Think about how you can protect them, how you can support them, because that is why we do what we do, is to give users a better experience. And it's easy to sit back and get lost in trying to solve a technical problem and forget about whether it's actually a good experience. So I like to really try and keep focused on that fact that it is ultimately always about the person who's using it. So I guess my closing comment essentially is just to be empathetic. You don't know what somebody's thinking. You don't know how they're going to use it or how they're going to try and use it, but you can at least think about it and care about it. We're all going to just do the best we can. I am never inclined to be critical of whether somebody has failed, but I am willing to be critical if they haven't tried.
That's incredible. That's incredible. And that just made me think of another question. I do see, and again, this could be off camera, but the connection between user experience and accessibility seems to be an area where most people don't think, because again, I always think if you make something usable, you're considering someone that may need it for special needs. And now it seems like user experience is becoming bigger, but I don't see it totally aligning in all cases. Do you see its user experience in a similar way, or?
I mean, there are differences between what is literally user experience and what is literally accessibility. Because you've achieved accessibility if you've just made something possible to use. I mean, that's great. But there is a level past that where you can actually try and make something pleasurable to use. If you're not, an assistive technology user yourself, you may just not be able to assess that. From a practical standpoint, I do testing with screen readers, and I do not even attempt, practically speaking, to judge whether or not it's a joyful experience. Because for me, it's not. And it is just not. But I do try and think about like, well, okay, was that an appropriate amount of information to be delivered? Because you can always go, I've encountered some sites where they've gone way overboard on the idea of just adding more accessibility. And it's just like, there's an ARIA description and there's also an ARIA labeled by, and like you get to a single link and it reads like 3 paragraphs of text. And you're kind of like, I don't think I needed that much information. I've had this intention for years to write an article that's basically titled Accessibility with Enough Information, because it's a balance. It's not, just keep giving more and more information. Give what's necessary and what's helpful, and accept that people will explore. Like, they don't need to get the entire history of why a control is labeled publish. It's okay. If they need that, they can explore and find it. But it's a complicated topic, because what is enough is not a simple question. It's actually pretty complicated. I think I've kind of gotten lost off topic, but I'm not sure.
No, it's perfectly fine. And my conversation sort of go this way, so I apologize. Because I know for me, I try to take a simple approach to accessibility and not overcomplicate things. So it sort of goes to what you were saying. Absolutely. And I think some folks think accessibility is too complex to even attempt it. But I think if you try to solve a problem simply and make sure that, like you were saying, it's an enjoyable experience, then you're sort of on your path. You don't have to put a lot of icing on the cake when you're doing it with that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and like going back to screen reader testing, if you focus entirely on, say, just using the tab key and jumping from control to control, and that is your experience of a screen reader, you might come away with the impression that, oh, these buttons need to say a lot more because I don't know what the context is. But that's not a realistic use of a screen reader, because you're not doing the reading part. You're just doing the operating part. You're going through all of the tools. But there's a whole different aspect where the screen reader is used to actually read the text and get context and get the environment you're sitting in. So all of that is available. It's there. It's just, as a sighted user, you're used to things being very nonlinear. Like, you look at a page and you see that button, and in your peripheral vision, you see everything around it. So you know immediately it's, above a big content field, and it's, next to a save as draft button and all of that kind of context. And you don't need to express all of that in some additional descriptive text. That's in the structure of the page. And somebody might have to explore to figure that out, because they are dependent on a linear progression or on a structured presentation of that document, but it's still there. So sometimes you just need to be careful about not getting too carried away.
Wow. Well, I'd like to thank you again, Joe, for taking the time to do this. Like I said, this is a high point for me and an inspirational point, being able to bring this event to the community and really put the focus where it needs to be on accessibility, and hopefully inspire some people to really get involved and really contribute in where WordPress goes. I know for me, in the past 4 years that I've gotten back into the community and really tried to make an impact, I mean, I want to do something to really make a mark in accessibility, and I really want to contribute. So I think this is going to go a long ways to getting other people involved and hopefully inspire them to do something great.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Joe. I am glad to be here. It's been a pleasure having this conversation, and thanks so much for all of your hard work when we did do WordPress Accessibility Day. We really couldn't have wrangled all of that without you. So
awesome. It was my pleasure. Like I said, I tend to go overboard in everything that I volunteer for. I really wanted to get a flavor for what the team was about and what the event was about, and just being able to meet all the great people behind the scenes and interact with the speakers was an incredible opportunity. And it sort of gave us the headwinds to sort of make some more progress throughout the rest of the year in accessibility. So thanks again for having me.